Hello and welcome to another edition of Hard Labour. Today I'm with Professor Thom Brooks of Durham University. You're a Professor of Law and Government here and also Labour Party Advisor. So today we're going to be talking about the obsession, the absolute crazed obsession that the Tories have with small boats. Now, Tom, have you just recently published a paper about the small boats?
And of course, small boats are not just an obsession about, canoes and kayaks. This is about small boats is sometimes too generous a term for what can be even kind of paddling pools used as sea vessels, actually, in some cases. Transporting people across the channel. Yes.
Wow. That's pretty dangerous.
It's hugely dangerous. And of course, it's also a very busy route. So it's not just because of waves, it's not just because of likelihood of risk of drowning crossing on any day, but also you've got a lot of ferries, a lot of traffic going back and forth between Britain and France anyway, commercial traffic, in addition to the normal hazards.
Well, I remember years ago when I was crossing the Atlantic on a cargo ship via Iceland, and there was just, you see on the radar, there was no boats anywhere near us, and as soon as we got anywhere near the channel, the whole radar, it looked crazy. Like there were so many vessels, submarine cables, oil rigs, fishing boats, ferries, you name it, and it was just like that. It looks absolute bedlam.
Despite the fact there's a tunnel going on along the ground as well, but there you are.
There is a tunnel.
The tunnel.
So with the small boats, this didn't seem to be a problem a few years ago, or am I just imagining that?
You're imagining nothing. So on the one hand, there's been boats coming across to Britain in various cases for a long time, the Spanish Armada and various things. But in terms of this,
not very successful.
No, not at all. But this thing is very recent. So there's no recorded small boat journeys taken. There's no migrants on small boats coming claiming asylum recorded by the Home Office at any point prior to 2018.
At all?
None.
No one was coming over in boats?
Nothing recorded, no. Now, the fact the Home Office wasn't keeping records doesn't mean that there wasn't anyone coming across that just wasn't noticed. But there's no one that has been noticed before that. 2018 is the first recorded small boat crossings claiming asylum that the Home Office has records of.
So what happened, what changed in 2018?
Well, if you listen to the government, it's not quite clear what changed. So they claim that there's illegal criminal gangs, involved in human trafficking. They're surely right. They don't say that anything about why these criminal gangs have chosen, after 8 years of Tories being in government, to begin sending people across on small boats. So you don't hear anything about that. But what the causes are of this,
They're saying it's coincidence, though.
It just seems to be a coincidence that this is just a thing that has happened, and it's something to, and the Prime Minister has made it one of his 5 kind of key pledges, goals, that he was going to stop the small boats, something that they've been saying ever since the first small boats were recorded. And of course, the more they keep saying they're going to stop the small boats, Graham, the one thing that seems to be true is that there seems to be more that come afterwards. But I think that there is a cause to this. I think you can kind of link some things to it.
Does it begin with B?
Not blueberries. Well, I think it is related to the Brexit deal. I think
there we have it.
Yeah, no, you'd be maybe unsurprised to hear this. I think the Brexit deal did have a very big part to play in this. I think the primary factor, not the primary cause, the cause of sending people across does seem to be the gangs, but they seem to be exploiting a change in the law. So what happened in 2018? These are kind of hypothetical questions. I don't need you. I'll answer them for you. But something happened in 2018 that made this a thing, and then something happened from 2020 where they really took off. Where they went from 299 people crossing in 2018 to about 17,000 or so in 2020, and then going very quickly escalating to over 45,000 last year. The estimate at the moment of the Home Office is it could be as high as 85,000 this year. Their low estimate of the Home Office right now is that it'll be slightly more than last year, and last year was the most ever. And remember, 2017, there were none. Now, to kind of get to the bottom of what I think this causes, and I want to tell a very quick story about it, is that one thing it isn't the closure of the jungle camp.
Yeah.
So some people say, well, look, there's lots of migrants coming across the Mediterranean, and all of Europe is seeing a large influx, and that is a natural connection to all of this, and that's what's really behind this. Everyone is affected by the migration waves, and it's got nothing to do with Brexit or the Brexit deal.
They love saying that, don't they?
They like saying that quite a lot.
Excuses, that's what I call it.
I've never not heard that one before, but I'll start using it. But I that's completely wrong, because of course the what was called the migration crisis was 2015, not 2020. 2015 was the big worry, and then leading into
Germany took 1 million refugees.
It was shortly after. So 2015, 2016 was when you saw that big wave come into Germany, when you saw the height of the jungle camp. And how many people did we see at the height of the jungle camp? It was estimated to be about 7,000 people at most were there. That was then closed in 2016, heading into 2017. And we didn't see 7,000 people then travel across, either in the back of a lorry or on small boats. It wasn't anything like that. So when people say, well, look, it's these kind of big waves migration into Europe, well, the really big waves were happening years before, and that didn't lead to this, where most of the migrants who were coming across, and most of whom were getting refugee status, were settling in other parts of the EU, not all going to the UK. UK was getting a much smaller share than Netherlands, then Sweden, then Germany, then France, then Italy, then Greece, and so on and so forth.
I think there's a lot of conservative voters and people who don't have a soul who think that we shouldn't take any refugees at all. And their excuse is, well, they should all go to the first safe country, which means you'll have millions of refugees in places like Poland, Turkey, Papua New Guinea, and it's just like, why should they shoulder the entire burden when we're one of the richest countries in the world?
Well, I think one of the most interesting thing to me, and I'm sure will become one of the more interesting things for you, about people making that argument that refugees ought to make their claim in the first safe country they set foot in, is where do we see that in any legal arrangement? Where you see that is in something called the Dublin Regulation. So this is the EU agreement. So all EU countries, including of course the UK, as one of the original signers of the Refugee Convention, all were signed up to the Refugee Convention. And what EU countries decided to do as an EU bloc, basically, is they all had obligations to accept claims from asylum seekers whenever asylum seekers wanted to make a claim. Asylum seekers have the right to make a claim wherever they want to. They don't have to do it in the first or second place they go to. Doesn't mean that they have to be accepted whenever they make their claim. They ought to be scrutinized to make sure these things are valid, all the rest of it. But they can claim where they want to claim according to the convention. But amongst the EU countries, they decided amongst themselves that the first safe EU country someone set foot in, that is where someone could be returned. They had an internal returns agreement, and it basically played out like this. Folks coming across, and this was also a big issue with the migration crisis in 2015-16, folks coming across to Greece or Italy or elsewhere, but folks coming into Greece, for example, who then get registered, and then boom, take off to go somewhere else, and then make a claim discovered in France, Germany, Britain. They could then be returned to that first safe country in the EU they went to. And I use that language of first safe country because after, very quickly, Greece became overwhelmed.
Yes.
And Britain was no longer sending people back to Greece.
Because it wasn't safe.
Because there was issues in the accommodation and the management in Greece at that time. But that's the language of the first safe country is actually the EU's Dublin Regulation that we left. That was where you see first safe country, which we're out of that agreement. You don't see it elsewhere. Now, I think that that's one kind of thing that's relevant for this debate. But the other thing is this, again, going back to what was it about 2018, 2020, and what links them that explains what happened? I think the answer is not the migration crisis, because that was years before, when it started, with many others going elsewhere, and you don't have small boat issues to other EU countries. It is not the closure of the jungle camp, because that did not lead to the 40,000 people, 20,000 people coming across. That's all come much later afterwards. That's not explains it. I think one thing that helps explain it is, other than a couple boats that did happen right before it, but in 2018, we had legislation to begin the transition process. And it was after that was passed, to beginning the transition period, that's when the first small boats started to come across.
So legislation for Brexit.
For Brexit.
We activated Article 50.
Yes.
And said we are leaving the EU, and then people saw that, well, that means that the Dublin arrangement doesn't apply anymore. That's
my thinking. And in 2016, before the referendum, when there was a lot of debate about what Brexit might mean, what would it mean to, and a lot of folks were focused on the single market, folks were focused on the customs union and other things. I work in immigration. I was looking at things like the Dublin Regulation. And before the referendum took place, I wrote a thing we're in Durham, the local paper, the journal Newcastle, noting my prediction that if we were not part of the Dublin Regulation anymore, and I singled that out, I predicted a big rise in migration. I predicted there would be lives put at risk in coming across, because the change is simple, right? So when you're part of a returns arrangement, and there are non-EU countries that are part of this returns arrangement with the EU, Norway, Switzerland.
So we could have remained part of that even though we weren't part of the
Leaving
EU?
the EU, yes, yeah. So this is not about,
This is like the hardest of all hard Brexits.
Well, for those who say things like, is this about reversing Brexit? Is this about thwarting the will of people? No, you can have Brexit, you can have a hard Brexit, and you can still be part of this arrangement. This particular arrangement. And of course, you don't need to be part of this particular Dublin Regulation arrangement to have a returns agreement with EU countries. Anyone can do this, the United States can do this, and that doesn't have anything to do with Brexit per se. But with this, I predicted this would happen, and I raised this issue of that a hard Brexit could lead to something like this. The front bench of the Labour Party that I've been speaking with, I was recommending that they table questions in Parliament about what were the plans for the government if we left the Dublin Regulation, specifically left this EU-wide returns arrangement. And the answers came back from 2017 that there was no assessment for what would happen if we were outside it, that they had not planned, had made any plans for what would replace it. There was an effort made to try to include some returns arrangements in the Brexit deal. The hope was apparently to have some bespoke arrangement, which didn't happen. And so you have a track record here of people signaling before the referendum vote that there was the potential risk of crossings if we left the returns arrangement. You have the opposition tabling questions from 2017 every year, both houses, Lords and Commons, putting this on the table about, what are you doing about this? What assessment have you made? Have you looked at the impact of not having a returns arrangement, the government being put on warning that this is an issue, nothing happening, and then we have January 2020 and we leave. And I think the thing that does tie things here is that heading into the latter part of 2018, after the passing of the EU withdrawal bill, entering the transition period, you had by that time already had 2 years of people flagging in Parliament this issue about the lack of a returns arrangement seemed to be a real risk. And as it was being flagged, you then began to see small boats happen. I'll explain a bit why I think it's small boats and not other transport. And then in 2020, when we left and did not have a returns arrangement, you then see this tick off. For those listening to all this stuff, and you're hearing me talk about returns arrangements, and what is that exactly? What is it? Why does it really matter? It may not be straightforward. Well, the answer is this. So, before January 2020, if someone set off either in the back of a lorry or on a small boat to come to Britain and were discovered, they could be, and often were, but not always, but often were, sent back to the first country in the EU that they had been discovered, first that they had appeared in. And the idea of the EU was not to make sure that everyone went to Greece or Italy to be processed. That was not the idea. The idea was to stop people from shopping around the EU, to make claims across all EU countries and wait to see, well, listen, if the Czech Republic won't do it, maybe Italy will do it, or maybe Germany will do it. It was an effort among themselves to coordinate that.
As much as it pains me to say this as a massive Europhile, I'm for a hard rejoin. I want the Euro, I want Schengen, I want us all speaking German. Oh, joking. But yeah, I think this was a huge policy cock-up by the EU. Especially in the height of the migrant crisis in the mid tens, because there must have been a better way. I.e., you arrive, you register, and every country in the EU, every country that's signed up to the agreement, takes their fair share of refugees. So you don't have countries that are taking 1 million and some countries that are only taking 26,000.
Well, there's certainly, you're right, that there was a big problem in the beginning of the migration crisis, because the way the system worked, you had a lot of folks. Greece was overwhelmed, I think it would be pretty fair to say. And so part of the EU's arrangement for trying to manage the crisis, as David Cameron was gearing the country up, this talk about emergency brakes and red cards to EU legislation, this all came up before when he was talking about his arrangements for the EU referendum. And during that time, the EU was in sensitive talks with Greece and Italy about setting up extra resources for bigger, better staffed, I think they call them reception centers or language to that extent. So there's one issue about this, that it did seem to put a great onus on some countries versus others. That's certainly the language you'll hear from Hungary makes this argument. Hungary's on the EU border. Exactly. So there's language like this. There's also there's lots of problems with the Dublin Regulation. One is this, but also a second is the original countries to sign up to the Dublin Regulation. It is you can send people to the first place, but for newer countries, they've begun a kind of a quota scheme, and there's talks in creating that have been on for a couple of years about. It's currently called the Dublin 3 regulation for those who want the legal talk on this. They're looking to do a Dublin 4 regulation of having a kind of quota scheme to make it more evenly distributed for everyone, and that hasn't happened yet, and that hasn't had agreement. The last of the big problems with the Dublin system, often pointed out, is that while anyone could be returned to the first place they're sent back to, they're not always sent back. And so what would happen is folks come across on a small boat, for example, to Britain. You discover, for example, let's make this up, there's 100 people, and say 50 come from France, 50 come from Germany, just to pick close-ish neighbors. So you then, because they were identified in those countries before they came here. So you write to France and say, we got 50 people to return who've been at your country first. We have a returns arrangement, take them back. Germany, we got 50 of your folks, take them back. It's then up to those countries to accept that their records do say that they did go there first and that they will take them back. And often what happens in the system is that many of the people who've been at another EU country first are returned, but it's not all, and it's not always most of them either are returned. Right. And so one of the things in talking, as I have, to senior ministers, talking to senior civil servants in the Home Office, they didn't seem to see leaving the returns agreement as an issue, because they said, well, there weren't many people in the system. There were only a couple thousand people, for example, they would call them clandestines. That was the name. Nice. Clandestines, for people who were clandestinely hiding in transport coming across. And that there weren't many people, and that the people that they would identify, they would be returned in their many hundreds every year to the EU, but it wasn't, but you were dealing with hundreds and small thousands. You weren't dealing with many tens of thousands, and so they didn't really think it was a big thing, and they didn't think it would be a big impact not being part of it. The numbers weren't that large, jungle or no jungle, for example. However, I would point out, hang on a second. So, in a system where if you are identified coming across, you're picked, the border agents kind of clock you on the shore and see you've been somewhere else first, whether it be France, whether it be somewhere else before you came to Britain, and you could be, and many were returned, they see in that system not many folks were sneaking across, and that those who are coming across were often doing so in their single digits. Right. It'd be a couple at a time, because you did not want to be caught. If you were caught, you might not be sent back, and as I said, not all were, but many could be, and of course all the agreement was there that all could be, in theory, returned, even if not all were. But then you switch to a system where you can't be returned, and if you're caught trying to come to the country without a tourist visa, without a work visa and other types of things, without a returns arrangement, well, it no longer really matters if people know you came from France. You ain't going back to France. You can be picked up and accommodated instead of trying to sneak one or two in, because the only way people are going to be able to get in is if they're not detected at all. In the old system, then the numbers were few, and the people at a time were small, relatively speaking. Of course, the risk was then high. They could be returned. But now that you can't be returned, there's no returns agreement. So now it doesn't really matter to some degree if people are caught, because they can then be accommodated. You're seeing boats now, year on year, the Home Office has watched, rightly with alarm, that more and more people are being packed onto these boats. More lives are being put at risk, because they don't have to be clandestine anymore. They don't need to be hidden. Being found means effectively being saved, and they can be then in this country without any, and you've seen the deportations of folks' returns, of course, have plummeted overall, because there's this kind of real problem of not being able to send people back. And so I think that the movement to a transition period where there was a cloud over whether or not people could be returned at all led to, seemed to coincide with the beginning of the small boats issue, and the rocketing of numbers after a point when no one could be returned, or most people couldn't be returned back, is not just coincidence. It seems that it's a change in the regulations that has been exploited by criminal gangs. I take the point that for many of the folks who've been trafficked or come across for whatever reason, I strongly doubt any of them would be on top of, and this is the Home Office data, that they often don't know what the UK rules are on this kind of stuff. So this thought about, oh, we'll change the law in Parliament by the end of the summer on this illegal immigration bill that's going to be allegedly presented today, that word will get out. And that the folks trying to come across will all now be dissuaded. They'll all now be folks who are willing to risk their lives on the high seas will now not do it, because they'll find out that we will expedite trying to do something about sending people back to countries that we might have no agreement to return people to, and so they can't be returned.
When you talk about criminal gangs that are exploiting this, do you also include in those criminal gangs the tabloids and the Tory party?
Well, I think that there's a lot of exploitation of this issue by various poets of the right-wing press. I think one of the things that really kind of gets me is that, whatever one's views are on immigration, it is, I don't even know the right language. I mean, gobsmacking, I could use much more foul language, but I'm going to try not to, for the sake this might be aired before the watershed. Is this right? So you don't have to be, so there's all this stuff that, the Labour Party is, for no checks on the borders, therefore unregulated, unchecked immigration, that they want to accept every claim of asylum seekers, that they, no control on borders, all this other stuff. This is all being said by a group of fools that
with an agenda.
With an agenda. So, all right. So this is just facts. I'm not going to get too strong on the normative judgments here, but the world record for Britain, if you can have that, for net migration. Net migration in Britain has never, in British history has been a lot longer than my native America, but there's never been net migration higher than 300,000 any year until Theresa May was Home Secretary. I mean, it wasn't until the Tories that we got over 300,000. At the moment, it's over 500,000. I'm not getting into the normative aspect, just in terms of if one is worried about how many folks are coming across the border, if your worry is net migration should come down, if your thought is you need to make it tens of thousands, I'm not, advocating for, no group has done this worse than the Conservatives. If your view on the other side is, we need to deport more people, we need more enforced removals, sending folks back. Again, not getting into the rights and wrongs. If your view is that, putting aside COVID, it has never been worse than under Priti Patel. And it seems it is going to new lows under Suella Braverman. It has never been less. For those, so if you worry about too many people coming in, well, that's exactly what you have with the Conservatives. And if you're worried about not enough people being sent enforced removals out, it's never been lower than under the Conservatives. And these are all happening, coinciding at the same time. Enforced removals are at a record low, net migration at a record high. There's lots of reasons for this in the back, but this is on their watch.
It can't be by accident.
It's not by accident.
The Conservatives are doing this on purpose because they'll stand up and say, this is our plan for the economy. We're going to grow the economy. We're going to increase exports. And then the fifth one is small boats. It just says small boats. It's like something from South Park. You're like, where did that come from? It just says small boats. What?
Well, my American friends and family are, they're kind of like, what's the matter with Britain and small boats? Is there some kind of tax? Do you need to have a yacht? They think when they think small boats, they think that, are we canoeing too often? What? So no, by small boats, they don't mean people just enjoying a journey up and down the Tees or Ware River. They're talking about migrants coming across on various vessels to claim asylum. That small boats is shorthand for something else. It's a weird shorthand to other countries that don't quite get what we're talking about.
They're using this issue, which I believe they created on purpose, as a Trojan horse to try and reduce our human rights. And the front cover of the Mail newspaper today was basically, yay, let's get rid of human rights for British people. And I'm looking at this thinking, is it not humans who read this paper? Are they reading it and going, oh, they must be talking about those other humans, not me, not my rights?
Well, again, I think very shocking about some of this stuff is, firstly, there is stuff said in the conservative-friendly press that somehow the problem here is the European Convention on Human Rights. That if we didn't have the European Convention on Human Rights, then that's somehow the big problem in why folks are not being able to be deported as quickly and as often as we see, and that is a problem.
Was that the convention that was drafted mostly by British lawyers and then foisted on the rest of post-war Europe?
This was a convention where conservative party lawyers were at the heart of drafting it, and I know more than one senior conservative former minister who is of the strong view that they're, when you talk to folks, I mean, Robert Buckland, I think, is one amongst many who's very publicly in favor of the European Convention on Human Rights and says, look, actually, it's a great achievement of the Conservatives. He sees it as a conservative achievement. Much as many in Labour will talk to the NHS and the Clement Attlee years, he says, well, look, actually, the European Convention was a good thing. And it did, and there's something important about there not being some type of piecemeal approach to how asylum works, that there ought to be some kind of shared platform respecting rights and uniformity and respect for humanity and all the rest of it. We can argue about where the lines are drawn, but there ought to be some kind of common platform, and that for him and for many others, and as a line, this is they see it as a conservative achievement. That's one thing that strikes me as kind of odd, hearing some things about how this is somewhat a problem. It'd be almost like the Labour Party claiming that the way to improve hospitals is to get rid of the NHS. Like, well, hang a second, that's one of the things that the party, many parts of the party, most of the party, probably most proud of. It's a kind of an odd thing to kind of sink that. But
do you think that's to do with the Tory party basically being taken over by UKIP, who's, I mean, their first thing was to destroy Britain's economy, and I think their second thing is to destroy the Conservative Party's legacy, because so many things, including the single market, which were proud conservative achievements of the 20th century, are being swept away, or have been swept away, by these nutters in charge.
Well, I mean, I don't know about Conservative Party membership and all the rest of it. I think that there is something deeply uninformed about thinking the European Convention somehow is the problem, because I have had confidential conversations with very senior people at the Home Office, and they have pointed out to me the issue is not really the European Convention. The issue is actually UK domestic law on how our laws are done. And this line, and viewers do not need to take my word for this, because this is said by the current immigration minister, Robert Jenrick, said in late November in a parliamentary question, asked about what was being done to change the laws about this, and he noted a particular case in English that was involved in the immigration tribunal here about UK law, management of things here, not the European Convention, that was something that he wanted to reform. And so it was an issue, and noted in this question that you in particular will enjoy, noted that this issue of the upper tribunal relating to immigration law in Britain does not affect Germany and other countries. And the question was asking about, like, why do we not? So this is the issue, right? Germany is able to process applications more quickly than Britain. Germany removes more failed asylum seekers than Britain. And the issue is, why aren't we like this? And that should raise some issues for those who want to blame the European Convention. I'm not suggesting that anything is perfect or that nothing is possible of reform. But if the European Convention was the issue, and that's what's kind of holding Britain back, then the questions for anyone who has that view is, then why in God's holy name is it the case that almost all of Europe processes asylum applications more quickly, has lower, those who are concerned about the acceptance a rate of asylum seekers and so on and so forth. There's a lot of talk about, say, Albania has been singled out, targeted, and
But isn't it 80% of applications are genuine, found to be genuine?
well, most of the small boat arrivals have been successful, either on their first application or on appeal. Most people have been successful. And the acceptance rates, you hear a lot in the news. I heard it this morning on the Radio 4 coming into work this morning. This argument that always singling out Albania, which was the biggest nationality to come across the small boats last year, but not the biggest number in previous years. And every year it seems to be a bit different. And a number of people at the Home Office have been, they won't put their names on the record, but they have been in the press, noting in the press, that this singling out of nationalities is dangerous, not just because of scapegoating, not just because of tensions that it creates unnecessarily with other countries and foreign relations, but because year on year the nationality seems to change depending on different circumstances, different countries. And that's for Albanians, for example. So the argument said by some conservatives is, look, this is not a war-torn country, that these are all economic migrants, and that they're not bona fide, genuine asylum seekers. Well, the fact is that the acceptance rate, that Britain accepts, I believe, most of the applications that come forward. The percentage is much higher than elsewhere in Europe. The percentage is something like 0 in Sweden, I think. It's something like 6% or less in France.
The acceptance rate.
Acceptance rate, yeah. Yeah, because they'll be officially ruled a safe country.
From Albania.
Okay. From Albania. And so then Albanian nationals claiming asylum have to claim there's some exceptional circumstance affecting them. That in a sense, this is not the right legal way of putting it, but effectively there's a count against them on their nationality. They have to kind of prove, despite their nationality, this is the case. And the way it's been managed here has been done differently, and that has been another issue. Yeah. So for those blaming the European Convention and saying if only we got out of the European Convention, we could then, for example, target Albanian and or other nationals and reduce their number, reduce the acceptances, turn these folks back and remove them, that we need to do that. The fact is, we've got countries that are at 0% accepting nationals from Albania, that are members of the European Convention, and that have shown that you don't need to do anything like that, to process more quickly, to take action against nationalities they want to do, to return people. They don't need to do any of this stuff. And so, doesn't mean, it means that they don't need to leave the convention to do that.
Yeah. How do you, if you are not a citizen of Hong Kong, Ukraine, or Afghanistan, how can you claim asylum in the
safe
UK?
and legal routes? Well, I mean, at the moment, what you do is you arrive and claim asylum. I mean,
okay,
so
arrive how?
Well,
can you fly
small
in?
boat.
Will they let you on a plane?
Sure. No. I mean, the answer is, of course, there is no safe and legal route except for specific nationality routes, and that's a very big problem.
So basically, there's no website that you can go on. Like my Ukrainian friends went on a website and they applied for asylum. They were fostered by, adopted, whatever the word is, accommodated by a British family who put themselves forward to say, we will have people come and stay with us while this war is going on. And they could apply for that while they were in Ukraine, or while they were in Poland, or while they were anywhere in the world. And we could say yes or no. Now, if we said no, for whatever reason, I don't think we did say no to any of them, but if we did say no, they would be turned back at the border if they tried to turn up. And if they turned up on a small boat, we would have grounds to deport them back to where they're from. Because they'd have to say where they're from in their application to come here. So what's stopping the British government from making a website, getting rid of all of the people traffickers, getting rid of all the unsafe routes, and giving people who are applying for asylum under the UN Convention of Human Rights, Article 14, or under the UN Declaration about Refugees of 1951, what is stopping them from doing that? apart from they're evil.
Oh, yeah, they just don't want to. I mean, of course they can if they want to, and it is a. So on the one hand, we're hearing about this new bill that it's somehow going to make arriving on the shore illegal, and then people can be deported. The fact is that was already the case.
Yeah.
So it's already a problem. The National Alien Borders Act was one move here. There's others. This is already in place, but there's already a convention. What's the language I want? We've accepted a convention that we will kind of hear cases made by asylum seekers, and so you've had folks who've arrived who, the government will say, oh, this is illegal immigration.
Yeah.
They've arrived illegally. There is no safe and legal route for most nationalities, as you pointed out, and so then they can be deported. But people, perhaps obviously have been making asylum applications regardless of the fact, after making these dangerous journeys, they're making these applications anyway. And according to press reports from the right-wing press about this bill, and I'm looking forward to seeing the detail shortly, but apparently there are going to be, so one is this idea of making it illegal to come to this country without a visa as a tourist, student, worker, family member. This is already in place, and so to do this is unnecessary. I can turn to some things in the bill that I think are different, but that's already kind of there. And it's not quite clear what new it's going to do. There's supposed to be, the Home Secretary is supposed to have some overriding duty to reasonably get rid of folks or something like this, and that's supposed to be something to kind of add some weight against other rights, and there's a question mark in its defenders as to whether this is a breach of the Human Rights Act and other things, and that tells you immediately that there probably is a breach of the Human Rights Act before you even look at it. If they think there might be, then there definitely is. The risk has already been identified.
And this plan to send asylum seekers, even if they are genuine, even if they are real refugees fleeing war or persecution with nothing but the shirts on their back, they've lost everything, they've lost their home, they've lost their job, they've lost everything they had in life, and they struggle across continents, across seas to get here, and then they are sent, even if they're genuine, they're being sent to Rwanda. Now, how can that be legal under international law? Well, because Rwanda's not particularly safe in that, okay, it's better than some of the other countries in the neighbourhood, like Democratic Republic of Congo, but Paul Kagame, who's the president, has been in charge for over 20 years now, and he runs the place with an iron fist.
Well, officially, the government has said that if a Ukrainian national, for example, or some from Afghanistan, who might qualify under the safe and legal routes, if they were to make the small boat journey, that they would be liable for deportation to Rwanda. So that's an official line. Right. The court, in hearing the case, the latest decision on this, said that they found that the scheme was lawful effectively on its face, because so it's not just Britain putting people on an airplane and then over to you, Rwanda. That Britain has promised that it will pay for the accommodation, it will pay for the legal representation, it will pay for the subsistence, it will pay for integration work, it'll pay all these costs. So it's not.
And don't we take refugees from Rwanda as well? Don't we?
Well,
equal number of people
I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't have the statistics to hand. But so the costs here in what's going. So part of what I think was providing the metaphorical fig leaf legally to the government was that no one had been sent, so there was no material evidence that the scheme wouldn't honor all the Britain's commitments. Part one. Part two, that Britain would, for all intents and purposes, be doing everything but judging the case. It would be for Rwanda to say yes or no to accepting someone's claim, but much of the work legally integration, social support, accommodation, food, subsistence, all this was being provided by Britain.
This is madness.
Just
to
have
cost
it
more.
do there than have it here.
And also, we don't let asylum seekers work in this country, do we? Except under certain circumstances. Well,
there's certain they have to wait a year.
A year.
And then after a year, you can apply for the right to work.
Does America do that?
No, and you can only do that. You can only apply if you can show you are on the occupancy shortage list.
Oh my
So
word.
if you're not on the shortage list, then you can wait many years
So
and you're not allowed to work.
We've got all these vacancies across the NHS and across all kinds of private companies across the UK, and basically we're telling workers that they can't work.
Well, that's right.
Bonkers.
Well, I mean, and some would say going a bit beyond the refugee issues, the government makes a lot of wanting more British-born, as it were, or British citizens as doctors and nurses, but it has been unwilling to fund any places. And so there are a couple medical schools in this country where all of the students are foreign because the government won't fund any places, even though there are many people who have the grades and the interest and desire to do this. They just can't get a place. So they have to go other places to do it.
There's so much to talk about on this subject. I mean, there's also...
But sorry to open that up.
No, it's fine. The fact that this Rwanda idea came from Australia, where they sent people to the Pacific island of Nauru. That's right. Which I spent 4 days in once. There's not much to do in Nauru.
A fascinating book, by the way. You should all go to read it. I recommend it again. A link will be provided.
A link will be provided in the description. No. But yeah, and also the fact that this has been an ongoing thing for ages now, a weapon of mass distraction. And it works. Every time people go, oh, but what about the refugees? What about the refugees? And it's infuriating to me that at this time, when billionaires are getting richer, these massive oil companies and energy companies are doubling their profits, and we're paying for it, and that's being topped up by taxpayers' money, which we're also paying for. Incredibly frustrating. And they're saying, no, they're not the problem. The rich are not the problem. The problem is the poorest and most wretched people on the planet, the people fleeing war and persecution. It's all their fault. That society is where we are now.
The Nauru example, this small country in, I think, Micronesian area. You've been there. You can correct my geography. I have American roots, so it's okay. I mean, if I don't know where things are, but But,
I think Nauru is technically Micronesia. It's kind of on the border between Melanesia and Micronesia.
You know these things better than I do, so I defer to your travel knowledge. But one thing, but on the immigration front, so Nauru was used as a place where folks coming to claim asylum in Australia, the thought was we'll send them to another country to be processed, and that would be a kind of a glorious idea. One issue that happened was there turned out to be a lot of abuse happening on some described it as a kind of a prison camp that a part of the island. That was one issue. Second issue, it costs about $1 million Australian dollars a year per person to continue this.
Exactly. I mean,
there's currently, last I saw, I think it was a Guardian report on this. There's, I think, in the neighborhood of 114 people left on this island. There's been no one sent to this island in 6, 7, 8 years, possibly longer. So this is this kind of successful policy, as it's described by some parts of the British press, is one that the Australians have stopped using. Moving on towards a decade of not wanting to use it. Costs over $1 million Australian dollars per person. The population is declining. They're removing. The population is declining over time. It is not increasing, and they're not using it themselves. And it's not a model that others have said. You know what? New Zealand hasn't said we've got this all wrong. We ought to follow. It's not something that others have taken on themselves. But one of the things that kind of jumps out to me on the Rwanda thing. I mean. The price tag is eye-watering
Yeah.
The waste.
It makes no moral sense.
The
but
waste
also
is
it
incredible.
Makes no economic sense at
The
all.
Rwandan
It's
government.
the stupidest thing we could possibly do.
Well, the Rwandan government says things like they don't have more at the moment, more than about 200 places for folks to come anyway. The leader of
tiny country.
The Rwandan government made a comment in the last few weeks. He mentioned war-torn Congo. There's a lot of refugees from Congo coming to Rwanda. Rwanda recently said that they do not have space to accommodate any more refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, it might be because they can make space if the government was paying them, like Britain is paying, who knows. But one issue is the cost. Second issue is the Rwanda saying they don't have space for anybody. They don't seem to have any space for them. But a third issue that I'll highlight for the enjoyment, the audio enjoyment, certainly not visual, for listeners is this. When the government has been asked about, so tell us about your assessment of the deterrent effects. What estimate do they have of how few, because this is often said, this will be a deterrent. We want a deterrent kind of policy for this. This is why we're doing it. We want to deter, I mean, the thought of this. So what is your view on people fleeing war? We want to deter them from coming to Britain. This, you know, some would raise some moral issues about, do we want to deter Ukrainians from coming to Britain temporarily, etc. No, certainly.
It's one of the hardest countries in Europe to come and claim asylum in. And we did that on purpose because we're idiots. I mean, honestly, I think that the IQ of Britain has dropped dramatically in the last sort of 40, 50 years. And I don't really know why. Maybe it was all the lead in the pipes and the...
Well, I mean, I have no comment. I have no comment about that. But the Prime Minister has made the comment that he thinks, you know, what was this comment? That people should be doing maths until 18 or something. There should be more maths training. Well, they can work on their maths on the Home Office. So in terms of the maths, they said that they have no estimate. There is no projection for what difference the Rwanda policy will make on numbers because, quote, there is a multiplicity of factors. And because of this multiplicity of factors, they can't possibly guess as to what difference it would make for people coming across, nor will they give any estimate for what they think the policy will cost. Now, people have said, well, look, you've already spent 120 or so million pounds already on this, and no one has spent a cent across. So, you know, when you agree to go ahead with this, and this is over the judgment of the top civil servant about value for money, it was claimed that the civil servant did not see the value for money. It had to have an express direction from Priti Patel to go ahead and do this anyway. The official argument of the government is that they are providing, they have no estimate for what this will cost per person, and they will not provide any estimate per cost because they believe that the cost will be, the true cost will be known over time as people send over. Of course, they're worried that it may be very, very, very expensive before anyone at all is sent over. And so the first group, you divide that by 1 to 5 people, 10 people, it'll look a lot, you know, their hope is, I guess, that this will become a route that is used, and as more people do it, then the average cost might come down. But they claim to officially have no idea about how much this will cost per person, and nor are they looking to have an idea. And they claim you can't estimate any effect of their policy, yet claiming that the justification, not just moral, political, otherwise, is that it will deter. It is the fact it will do this. If you say that, you know, we're going to have this punishment for a crime because we want to lower the number of criminals, we want less crime in this area, and crime doesn't go down. Well, guess what? It didn't work. And what you said, you know, it's kind of like saying, you know, we're the only party that takes border control seriously. We are the party that will bring down the numbers. We'll do this. And then you see the facts and like, actually, it's never been higher year on year than on your watch.
Talking of that, what is the Labour Party's policy when it comes to immigration? What are they going to do differently to what the Conservatives are doing? Is there an idea to make a website so people can apply? Are they going to get rid of the Rwanda policy entirely? What's going to happen?
Yeah, so on the one hand, you hear a lot of this rubbish from the government that somehow Labour has no policy other than leaving an open door, said by folks who have let in, effectively more net migration than any government has in the history of Britain, going back 1,000 years, it would seem. So there's a view. So the policy, and it's been one that's been said for a while, one is on the small boats issue in particular, so that there would be a scrapping of the Rwanda policy, so that would not happen. The money spent on that would be used, redirected to the National Crime Agency to crack down on the gangs and do more cross-border work on that. There's a lot to be said about the UK-France cross-border stuff, of which has been various piecemeal things over the years by multiple governments of multiple stripes. But that would be one thing. And the thought is that if the problem here is the gangs that are the ones that are organizing the people traveling across, they're the ones exploiting the money, putting lives at risk, saying, oh, look, you want to do this? I know where I can send you. I know how I can organize this. And they're the ones fueling this. Then why is nothing being done about them? It's interesting that the folks who will be banned by today's legislation, if it passes, without amendment, the folks will be banned from ever coming back to Britain. There'll be a permanent ban on re-entry or citizenship for those who are potentially the victims of trafficking on these small boats, but not the gangmasters who are behind sending the boats across. I mean, that is, I think, an extraordinary thing, and they'll be more harsh towards folks who might be put on these boats, and coerced onto these things. There'll be more punishment for them than, as it were, if someone has been convicted of homicide. They could still be
a Tory party policy. I mean, what's Labour going to do differently?
Oh yeah, so Labour do several things different. So one would be going after the gangs rather than effectively trying to criminalize again folks coming across. So there would be an end to the Rwanda policy, the money redirected. The second thing would be that a returns agreement. So I've been big, and I've been very pleased, this has been the case all along, that there would be a returns agreement. That would be a big part of the strategy. It's noticeable and perhaps unsurprising, given how much the Conservative Party has made an enemy. They've kind of tried to do negotiation with the EU by trying to, walk out of the room or this kind of stuff, and doing some kind of moves that might work in a movie, but don't seem to have a correspondence to how negotiations actually work in actual boardrooms.
Has there been any movement towards making safe and legal routes available? Because at the moment, there aren't any, as we discussed earlier. And setting up a website where you go to the embassy, the British embassy in the country that you're in, at that time you say, I need an application number because I want to apply. They give you an application number, you get online, and you have lots of different languages because we have the technology, and you can apply there and then, and you can get the permission to come to the UK as an asylum seeker, as a refugee, legitimately, and then fly into the country. And work from day one.
Well, Labour hasn't taken any view on any, there isn't any, I've heard nothing about wanting to set up websites or other things. I recommended in a Fabian pamphlet I published last year that there should be, amongst other things, an emergency visa program. So this doesn't go as far as what you're saying, but one problem of the Syrian refugee scheme, the Afghan citizen schemes, more than one scheme, and the Ukraine resettlement, is that each were done ad hoc. The crisis, Syrians were imperiled. And then, as people began the movements out, and the shelling had already happened, and people had died, then the government began to, we'll hold a meeting to discuss what we could do about this, and not coordinated so much with other EU partners.
There's always going to be refugees. There's always going to be people fleeing persecution. If you're gay in Uganda, it's not a good idea to hang around Uganda. And where are you going to go? at the moment, if you went to the embassy in Nairobi in Kenya and say, hey, can I have asylum in the UK, which was the former colonial power? One of the reasons why a lot of these countries are in the situation they're in at the moment is because of us. Like, we set up the system in which these countries are perpetually poor. We still exploit them to this day. And I just think that it would be a really good idea for Labour to take the bull by the horns and say, right, we are going to destroy the people gangs. We're going to destroy the people traffickers because they are going to have no market. There's going to be no one wanting to get in a boat to come here. Because I tell you this, like, you know, as much as you want a job, would you risk your life and your children's lives getting on a boat across the channel?
Well, I mean, you could only imagine doing so if you thought staying where you are might be worse.
Well, I mean, if you were completely desperate and you had
no home. That would be the thing. I mean,
would you do it for a job?
Well, of course not. No, of course
exactly.
not.
Well,
I mean,
this is the argument.
It's hard to imagine yourself in these positions, and I think that's often, you know, when I put my hat on looking at criminal justice work I've done, a lot of the talk about, you know, deterrence has an important role to play in criminal justice context as well, but what often there's the criminological evidence about certain things that are effective at deterrence, and what those things are look very differently from what political commentators think will have deterrent effects. Folks who aren't, well, no, not yourself, but you know, folks who aren't themselves thinking about doing any crimes, what would deter them from doing stuff? And they kind of, it's a different mindset. You need to think about putting yourselves in the shoes of the people in that situation. What would influence their behavior, rather than some imaginary rational person that doesn't exist? What about lived experience? This goes back to nudge theory, Cass Sunstein, and all that kind of stuff.
I get
and
that.
I don't want to get too far into that, but like, what actually works? I mean, so there's two things here.
One is, what would work is getting rid of people having to come across the channel. Because at the moment, like we keep saying, that's the only legal way, and it is legal, to come into the country. It's the only way to claim asylum if you're not from Afghanistan, Hong Kong, or. I
think one thing that would be good, no matter who is in government, there will be generically called emergency visa schemes for big crisis regions, rather than coming up with broadly similar but somewhat different ad hoc programs for one nationality and another. I think there should be something off the shelf where there's a plan. So instead of, as Ukrainians are
next
fleeing
time
for their
you're
lives,
chatting with Labour,
let them know.
Let's just make a website, right? Come on, I'll do that.
You're very good at websites. I mean,
I'm good at websites. Come on, we'll do it now. We'll do it. Come on.
Well, I mean,
let's do it now.
So one thing was the emergency visa program, which is different. The other thing is, I think a returns agreement is very important, because I think one thing that's often said by folks in Labour is that and this is also something that conservatives will say as well, at the issue of refugees fleeing Syria, Ukraine, and other countries that have a name scheme, countries that do not have a name scheme, that they're going all over the place. There's, you know, this issue, this problem of how to provide support is a problem that isn't just Britain's. And there's an argument as to which countries are doing enough to do things about it, and which are, you know, doing, you know, more than or less than their fair share, etc. But there's an issue of coordination. It's an issue that affects more than one country, that requires it's an international issue, and it requires a more a wide approach. Now, one issue is, you know, global approaches can involve the globe. These things, UN level, very hard to do.
UN's impossible. But the EU is manageable.
I'm going to regional, and you know, and having some kind of regionally coordinated approach seems to be the way to do about it. Well, I think you know, if we could be part of some type of returns agreement, it doesn't have to be the same Dublin regulation we're in, but something on that order, where we were working with partners in the France, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, elsewhere, working with these countries, again, both EU countries and non-EU countries, about what are we all going to collectively do about making this work better. I think that would be a helpful step forward, and I think that would be a good way forward.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tom, for joining us
Pleasure's
on this
over.
edition of Hard Labour. And yeah, until next time, I will see you soon.